Dear honored guests, I am proud and excited to speak before you today on marking a quarter of a century to the foundation of the Jewish Deaf Research Center, JDRC. It's important for me to point out how blessed I feel standing next to inspirational women such as Mala Berkowitz, Nomi Braun-Lerman, and Alexis Kesher. Should a person stop me on the street and ask me who I was in a single sentence, this is what I would probably say: a great believer in equal opportunities. If you would allow me to go into detail in more than a single sentence, I am Shirly Pinto, a member of the Knesset. I am deaf and I speak the Israeli Sign Language. I am a lawyer, a social entrepreneur promoting equal rights for people with disabilities. I have graduated a full and extended IDF service. I am a lecturer, a nonprofit organization founder, a member in the International Congress, and you might also be surprised to discover that I was a judge in the International Bible Contest for Adults. Yet my most impressive title is a mother to Nevot Tal and another one on the way. If I may, a bit about my way so far and about my personal beliefs. As I said, I'm a member of the Israeli parliament, the first deaf Knesset member in the history of Israeli politics. That is the last glass ceiling that I was able to break, and there will be more to come. From a young age, I was a social activist in promoting people with disabilities in general, and specifically those that are deaf and hard of hearing. I represent a public of 2 million people with different disabilities, those with physical, emotional, sensory, and mental disabilities, as well as other transparent diseases. Statistically, we're talking about 1 out of 5 people in Israel that have a disability. A public that has been driven to the margins of society, or what I refer to as human periphery. My main goal, as I see it, is to express their voices and to implement the demand to be an integral part of society, to design its agenda and to take part in public decision-making and the texture of life in Israel. Most of my childhood, I was living with my hearing grandparents, along with my sign language speaking parents. That way, I was able to speak both Israeli Sign Language and the Hebrew language. They did all they could and never gave up on making sure I would fit in an environment with children without disabilities. From a small age, I have experienced the difficulties of their lack of awareness and limited language accessibility in day-to-day life and in front of the authorities. The first glass ceiling that I broke was during my IDF service. I had to struggle for my basic right to uphold the law and enlist for mandatory service in the Israeli Defense Forces. I had to fight for the right to serve and to be swallowed up in cumbersome army bureaucracy that was not accessible at all for me. In order to get an answer for a question, I had to drive 3 hours by bus in order to meet face-to-face with a representative who might help me out. The army only had a phone, and to remind you, a phone is not accessible for a deaf woman and her deaf family, as in my case. In the end, I was able to finish a full and standing army service as a commanding officer in the Israeli Air Force Technical Brigade. For this duty, I was awarded with a merit award both from the commander of the Air Force and from the President of Israel. In Israel, as opposed to the US, young people who are interested in academical education are required to go through a very tiresome procedure, since the education system is not made accessible till high school. This creates a gap between people with disabilities and the rest of the society. Please notice that this is already the second point of inequality on the way to adult life. All this has not kept me back, and I've worked hard to receive my law degree. While being a student, I joined the Shema Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children. I was a youth counselor and a coordinator for informal education. Afterwards, I was appointed to the head of the Shema Club in Tel Aviv district. In 2016, I was among the founders of the Israeli Center for Deaf Studies, with a goal to promote the status of deaf and hard of hearing sign language speakers. It was important for me to promote awareness of equality between sign language and spoken languages, and to create awareness and acceptance for it by the public. During the way, I was exposed to the outrageous ignorance of people around me that could not accept me as a legitimate part of our society and culture. So I decided to solve it. And I got myself into the public discussion. I started spreading my language to other people. The first step was a bill to make governmental television broadcasts accessible with sign language. And as an extra step, in the same year, I founded the campaign Ani Mesamen Ani Shaveh to promote public awareness for the importance of Israeli Sign Language as a recognized language in Israel. This step was tremendous. First, Ben-Gurion University of the Negev was the first university in Israel to acknowledge Israeli Sign Language as an official language for the deaf. Later, the campaign found its way to the top of government representatives, including former Minister of Education and the current Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. We met back then to promote the education budget for special education students that would teach in deaf classes. And since then, we're devoted partners to this path. Let us move forward to the event that changed our life and perspective from the basis. The outbreak of the coronavirus, which has brought with it lack of certainty for the entire public and for people with disabilities specifically. Lockdowns, limitations, instructions, the public could not follow all of these. A multitude of declarations of public figures and high-ranking officials were not accessible. This caused confusion, frustration, and helplessness. Imagine that you're sitting on a couch with your family. There's a war outside, but no one would explain what's going on. There were no sort of media that could address people with various disabilities about the new guidelines and the courses of action that were taken. I then realized that I would have to immediately create a credible and accessible source for people with disabilities. I made a 24 accessible phone line that helped explain, simplify, and organize all guidelines. The phone line was also used for individual physical assistance. We had volunteers for shopping, getting medical supplies, as well as listening and providing emotional support. As a result, there were more emergency organizations that had joined and collaborated. Hundreds of thousands were able to get response for their needs by using this phone line. I would like you to see that with a bit of initiative, awareness, and goodwill, it is possible to mount achievements for the good of Israel's deaf population. Another example from the last unlucky time, the COVID that had forced us to wear masks that hide half of our faces, including the mouth, which makes it much harder for us, the deaf and hard of hearing, to understand what is being said to us, as we rely very much on lip reading and facial expressions to understand verbal and nonverbal communication. One of my first actions as part of the parliament, with cooperation with the Minister of Health, is making a ministerial instruction to approve supply and usage of transparent masks on demand in Israel's hospitals. Doing this, in a small but important step, the system learns to adapt itself to make accessible fundamental medical services. As long as countries treat the integration of people and children with disabilities as a national ethical mission with a regard for equal rights, so will the subject will be firmly fixed as a necessary social norm that will in turn develop the economy and human capital immeasurably. People with disabilities are patriotic citizens that are willing to do their part for the country. They have their duties, yet they do not receive the most basic rights as citizens. Some challenge me quite a bit and ask, aren't my aspirations too high? Do I really think that a deaf woman like me has a place among Israel's decision makers? The answer to this internal question is actually taken from our origins. Moses, the greatest prophet who took the Israelites from slavery to freedom, the leader who led the most profound changes in society structure in the Israeli people, was in fact a person with a disability. When God assigns Moses, who was stuttering, the most important mission of getting Israelites out of Egypt, Moses is concerned. He tries to convince God that he's not the right person for the task, and certainly not the right leader. He does not believe in his own abilities to lead people, especially when expecting the public response. Since he's stuttering, and the leader's primary ability is a rhetoric one, when he required to steer the hearts of his people, how would he be able to lead? That and more, Moses, who grew up in the heart of Egyptian leadership, was taught that the expected model of a leader, especially of an empire, is a high and mighty person, the image of God, flawless and perfect. However, God's point of view of leadership model is entirely different. God does not deny the publicity of Moses' disability, nor does he try to hide it from the people. Quite the opposite. He makes Moses' work accessible for him by assigning his brother Aaron, the great future prophet, to be his translator. The echoing message of the story is that leadership, success, or simple integration are not reliant upon physical appearances, but on the spirit and the path, and the message is, disability isn't disabling, it's the society that disables. The key to social and institutional paradigm shift of focusing on physical disability as a main feature which defines the person with disability and his complete identity starts with awareness. A different behavioral or physical appearance of people with disabilities sometimes creates, without justification, a fear or hesitation in the general society. The society's lack of capacity to include people with disabilities as a part of it denies a direct touch between these two populations and makes it harder to break the deepening prejudice between them. These stigmas and prejudice push people with disabilities to the society's margins, to the human periphery, till it slowly becomes transparent, irrelevant. And this distortion we must uproot. I believe that we should work with various tools to prevent alienation between people with disabilities and people without them, with the basic idea of promoting a culture of awareness and accessibility. We should do it based on the principle "nothing about us without us," that expresses the righteous and clear demand of people with disabilities to be present and leading in any discussion, and especially in determining the policy of their own integration in the general society. Thank you very much.